the new challenges of dialogue with creation from international agreements and Laudato Si Encyclical letter of Pope Francis. This special program of Silsila called Silsila School of Dialogue with Creation introduces to us a very alarming situation of the world today, that is the climate change. We started to present in the first lecture what religions say about dialogue with creation, especially Islam and Christianity. In the second lecture, we focus on climate change as an alarming reality in the world and the need for an holistic approach of cultural dialogue path to peace that, for us, in Silsila means dialogue with God, with the self, with others, and with creation. Today, we present the encyclical letter of Pope Laudato Si in the context of many other international agreements that is worthy to know, using some educational material that we choose from YouTube. The international community, aware of the alarming effect of climate change, has moved in recent time with more determination. Maybe we can say that it is still too little, but it is a sign of hope. We present here the most relevant international agreements, starting from the Montreal Protocol of 30 years ago, before focusing on Laudato Si of Pope Francis. 1987, the Montreal Protocol is an international treaty designed to protect the ozone layers caused by numerous substances that are responsible for ozone depletion. It was agreed on 16 September 1987 and entered into force in January 1989. Climate projections indicate that the ozone layers will reduce to 1980 levels between 2050 and 2070. Due to this widespread adoption and implementation, it has been held as an example of exceptional international cooperation, with Kofi Annan quoted as saying that perhaps the single most successful international agreement to date has been the Montreal Protocol.
I think we know as much about the climate issue today as we did about the ozone issue when we had the 1987 Montreal Protocol.
What if you took the results, the experiences that we used successfully in Montreal Protocol and applied that to global climate change? What if? Because we know that can work.
You have to have really good science. It has to be done extremely carefully. It has to be verified by multiple sets of observations.
We need to have coordinated research globally and international assessments so that the scientific community talks with one voice to the international negotiators.
Science is what made me confident that the public policy position I was advocating was sound, was supportable, was going to be important to the future.
think first the framework and the way it was set up. I think secondly the fact that it had an international ownership. I mean, so many countries participated, ultimately signed off on it.
The other is the flexibility that's built into the international agreement to modify that agreement as there's new science and technology.
One of the experiences with the Montreal Protocol is probably relevant to the climate change debate in that the initial agreement was not to solve the problem. It was to take the first step towards solving the problem.
Industry leadership in developing those new substances and alternative products is key to the success of any protocol.
It's important that industry knows that they're going to be given the opportunity to manage their way to a solution.
You know, because of the spirit of cooperation with the government setting standards that were challenging yet flexible, allowed industry to innovate, industry came forward, and everyone worked together to make this happen.
For those who think it'll be hard to lower our emissions of CO2, they need to remember that the CFC industry thought it would be hard, impossible, early in that process too.
We have a substantial scientific establishment, and they were right on this issue, it turns out. And when it was just a hypothesis, later it was all confirmed. And I think the same is true on climate change. Now we're getting not just computer models, but observations.
Governments have to give us the international regulatory framework, that is, what are the environmental obligations, and we need to empower the private sector.
You are seeing more and more companies step forward to the challenge of climate change and state that more needs to be done.
And frankly, that's what will drive that change even faster.
And all of us need to work together as an integrated team if we're going to solve these and address these problems in a cost-effective way.
1992, the Earth Summit. It's the first conference of this kind. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, commonly referred as a Rio Conference on Earth Summit, which succeeded in raising public awareness to the need of integrate environment and development. The conference drew 109 heads of state to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to address the urgent problem of environment protection and socio-economic development. The Earth Summit influenced subsequent United Nations conferences, including Rio 20, and set the global green agenda.
The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, also known as the Rio Summit, Rio Conference, and Earth Summit, was a major United Nations conference held in Rio de Janeiro from 3 to June 14, 1992. In 2012, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development was also held in Rio, and is also commonly called Rio Plus 20 or Rio Earth Summit 2012. It was held from 20 to June 22. Overview: 172 governments participated, with 116 sending their heads of state or government. Some 2,400 representatives of non-governmental organizations attended, with 17,000 people at the parallel NGO Global Forum, who had consultative status. The issues addressed included systematic scrutiny of patterns of production, particularly the production of toxic components, such as lead in gasoline, or poisonous waste including radioactive chemicals, alternative sources of energy to replace the use of fossil fuels which are linked to global climate change, new reliance on public transportation systems in order to reduce vehicle emissions, congestion in cities and the health problems caused by polluted air and smoke, the growing scarcity of water. An important achievement was an agreement on the Climate Change Convention, which in turn led to the Kyoto Protocol. Another agreement was to not carry out any activities on the lands of indigenous peoples that would cause environmental degradation or that would be culturally inappropriate. the Convention on Biological Diversity was opened for signature at the Earth Summit, and made a start towards redefinition of measures that did not inherently encourage destruction of natural ecoregions and so-called uneconomic growth. 12 cities were also honored by the Local Government Honors Award for innovative local environmental programs. These included Sudbury in Canada for its ambitious program to rehabilitate environmental damage from the local mining industry, Austin in the United States for its green building strategy, and Kaitakuya-sha in Japan for incorporating an international education and training component into its municipal pollution control program. Results: the Earth Summit resulted in the following documents: Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, Agenda 21 Forest Principles. Moreover, important legally binding agreements were opened for signature: Convention on Biological Diversity, Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Critics, however, point out that many of the agreements made in Rio have not been realized regarding such fundamental issues as fighting poverty and cleaning up the environment. Green Cross International was founded to build upon the work of the summit. See also, Earth Summit 2002 Rio+10 held in Johannesburg, Ecology Summit, Global Map, National Strategy for a Sustainable America, Precautionary Principle, Regional Forum on Environment and Health in Southeast and East Asian Countries, the Environmental Institute, United Nations Conference on the Human Environment 1972, United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development also known as Rio 2012, or Rio+20. Hosted by Brazil in Rio de Janeiro, as a 20-year follow-up to the historic 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, References. External links, documents from the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1992.
Hello, I'm Severin Suzuki speaking for ECHO, the Environmental Children's Organization. We're a group of 12 and 13-year-olds trying to make a difference. Vanessa Suddy, Morgan Geisler, Michelle Quigg, and me. We've raised all the money to come here ourselves, to come 5,000 miles to tell you adults you must change your ways. Coming up here today, I have no hidden agenda. I am fighting for my future. Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market. I am here to speak for all generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard. I am here to speak for the countless animals dying across this planet because they have nowhere left to go. I am afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in our ozone. I am afraid to breathe the air because I don't know what chemicals are in it. I used to go fishing in Vancouver, my home, with my dad, until just a few years ago we found the fish full of cancers. And now we hear of animals and plants going extinct, every day vanishing forever. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles and rainforests full of birds and butterflies, but now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. Did you have to worry of these things when you were my age? All this is happening before our eyes, and yet we act as if we have all the time we want and all the solutions. I'm only a child, and I don't have all the solutions. But I want you to realize, neither do you. You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert. If you don't know how to fix it, please stop breaking it. Here, you may be delegates of your government, business people, organizers, reporters, or politicians, but really, your mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles, and all of you are someone's child. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all part of a family, 5 billion strong. In fact, 30 million species strong. And borders and governments will never change that. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal. In my anger, I am not blind, and in my fear, I am not afraid of telling the world how I feel. In my country, we make so much waste. We buy and throw away, buy and throw away, buy and throw away, and yet northern countries will not share with the needy. Even when we have more than enough, we are afraid to share. We are afraid to let go of some of our wealth. In Canada, we live the privileged life with plenty of food, water, and shelter. We have watches, bicycles, computers, and television sets. The list could go on for 2 days. 2 days ago here in Brazil, we were shocked when we spent time with some children living on the streets. This is what one child told us. I wish I was rich. And if I were, I would give all the street children food, clothes, medicines, shelter, and love and affection. If a child on the streets who has nothing is willing to share, why are we who have everything still so greedy? I can't stop thinking that these are children my own age, that it makes a tremendous difference where you are born, that I could be one of those children living in the favelas of Rio. I could be a child starving in Somalia, or a victim of war in the Middle East, or a beggar in India. I am only a child, yet I know if all the money spent on war was spent on finding environmental answers, ending poverty, and finding treaties, what a wonderful place this earth would be. At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our mess, not to hurt other creatures, to share, not be greedy. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? Do not forget why you are attending these conferences, who you're doing this for. We are your own children. You are deciding what kind of a world we are growing up in. Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying, everything's going to be all right. It's not the end of the world, and we're doing the best we can. But I don't think you can say that to us anymore. Are we even on your list of priorities? My dad always says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. You grown-ups say you love us, but I challenge you, please, make your actions reflect your words. Thank you.
Very good. I would like to thank you, the four of you, for your participation in this conference and for reminding us that we are responsible for the world and for the future generations, and also for reminding us that we are responsible not only for our words, but also for our actions. I am keenly aware that what the four of you have said to us makes us all feel, to make a quote of a Brazilian poet, that we all have two hands and the sentiment of the world. And I think this is what you have expressed.
Making their schoolyard a bit greener. That's what pupils at the Bettina von Arnim School have been doing as part of a work group. Just one of many projects focusing on sustainability that are now available at German schools and colleges. The pupils continue to put time and energy into their creations, even once the project is over. That doesn't belong here either. 20 years ago, the term sustainability gained new currency thanks to the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. This year, the conference Rio +20 is taking place. Sustainability in education is an issue that has lower priority than others. Professor Dr. Gerhard de Haan of Berlin's Free University outlines what's been happening in educational institutions. There's a lot going on in schools, a bit in universities, and also a little in primary education. There's also been activity in the non-formal area too, that is non-school institutions and further education institutes, as well as in environmental centres. At the moment, there are about 300 courses in Germany focusing on the issue of sustainability. The course Sustainability and Quality Management at the Berlin School of Economics and Law is one of them. Sustainable business practices for companies and organizations. That's what students of Professor Dr. Anja Grote are studying. It's about authenticity and learning how I can try to change things, but also initiate change within myself, and how, in the long term, that can lead to sustainable business and trade. The successful training project Sustainable Bookbox allows children and trainees to get experience in the field. The book box is a restored telephone box which is to be used as a street library. Pupils at the Center for Color Technology and Spatial Design have been working on one of the book boxes. Department head Frank A. Dreyer explains what makes the project special. It's about working with certified wood, about the water paint, which we worked with, of course, that's vital, and the books, which aren't just thrown away, but are put in the box. It's about the opposite of what our throwaway society normally does. The transformed former telephone box really is something to look at. It's even equipped with solar power to provide light at night. The pupils are reassured by the reactions of passers-by. Suddenly everyone wanted to go in. They just wanted to grab a book and take it home, and the children loved it as well. Sustainability, a broad term in terms of education too. True, steps have been made in the right direction, but we haven't reached the finish line yet. The next goal is to go from individual projects to a situation where sustainability is fully integrated into school and college courses.
1997, the Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty which extends the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that commits state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions based on the scientific consensus of global warming. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Kyoto, Japan, on December 11, 1997, and entered into force on February 16, 2005. There are currently 192 parties to the protocol.
This is our world. According to leading scientists, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons are contributing to climate change. In the year 1997, representatives from more than 160 countries met in Kyoto, Japan, and committed to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. This is the Kyoto Protocol, and as of today, 184 countries have ratified it. For the developed world, there are many ways to achieve their targets of reduced emissions. One way is to partially pay for installations of technologies that lower greenhouse gas emissions in the developing countries. This is called the Clean Development Mechanism. For countries like India, China, and Brazil, it helps offset the costs of technologies and measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Consider a coal-based power company in a developing country as an example. Let's assume that for every kilowatt hour of power generated, 1 ton of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Now consider that the power company sets up a wind farm. If the next kilowatt hour of power is generated from wind instead of coal, carbon dioxide emissions are cut by 1 ton. Each ton of carbon dioxide reduced is worth 1 carbon credit. The power company can sell this carbon credit to a company in a country with emission targets who is releasing, say, 2 tons of carbon dioxide instead of 1. Without the sale of the carbon credit, it may not have been possible for the power company in India to finance the wind farm. There are many other projects that are eligible for carbon credits. These projects too can sell the credits in advance and use the funds towards implementing the project. Or a purchaser could pay a fixed price for the carbon credits as they are generated each year, and this contract may make the project more attractive to debt and equity providers.
The Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty that was made effective in the year 2005 by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC. The treaty was designed to set binding obligations on industrialized countries, or MEDCs, to reduce emissions of major greenhouse gases. This involves support for renewable energy, the improvement of energy efficiency, and the reduction of deforestation. UNFCCC's primary goal is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference of the climate system and the stabilization of the concentration of gases in the atmosphere. It is also important to note that LEDCs do not have binding targets under the Kyoto Protocol, but are however committed by the treaty to reduce their emissions. This is because they are not seen as the main culprits for emissions during the current period of industrialization.
In fact, in a meeting preceding this, all countries, all governments realize that industrialized countries will have to reduce their emissions by somewhere between 25 and 40% by 2020.
The reason for the creation of the Kyoto Protocol was that developed countries have contributed the most to the buildup of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, which was around 77% of emissions between 1750 and 2004. In the UN estimate of 2008 emissions, it shows that out of a total of 29,888,121 tons of CO2 emissions, 9,638,831 tons originated from the US and the EU combined.
Our challenge remains clear and urgent: to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to strengthen adaptation to the even larger climate shocks we know are on the way no matter what we do.
The targets for the first commitment period are over the emissions of the 6 main greenhouse gases. These include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. These greenhouse gases are the top gases which contribute to climate change. The greenhouse effect is the result of the atmosphere trapping the heat which radiates from Earth to space. Should climate change continue to increase at the current rate, there will be consequences that harm every country in the world, such as increased wildfires, droughts and desertification of land, increased duration and intensity of tropical storms, and flooding which leads to soil erosion. However, the Kyoto Protocol has also been the cause of a lot of controversy and opposition. The top 6 CO2 emitters are China, the US, EU, India, Russia and Japan. India and China have ratified the protocol but are without binding targets, being LEDs.
The United States refused to sign the last major international agreement on greenhouse gases, the Kyoto Protocol, which runs out in 2012.
The United States would convene a series of meetings of nations that produced most greenhouse gas emissions, including nations with rapidly growing economies like India and China. The way to meet the challenge of energy and global climate change is through technology. And the United States is in the lead.
Instead of mandates, each nation will set its own targets and come up with an individual plan of action based on its own unique mix of resources and energy needs.
Now clear that Kyoto is not the path forward for a global solution to climate change. If anything, it's an impediment.
It says here that the goals of the Kyoto Protocol are not established by science but rather by political negotiation and are therefore arbitrary and ineffective in nature.
And the issue of climate finance, well, for the most part, rich nations like the United States were not interested in pledging cash as they grapple with the financial crisis. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon warned in his opening address in Doha that events like Typhoon Bopha in the Philippines and Hurricane Sandy in the US could become the new normal. It's felt urgent action is required, but if this conference is anything to go by, urgency is in short supply.
And WWF, along with all of the other civil society organizations, we are hugely disappointed. I mean, this is a year when people all over the world felt the impacts of climate change. Yet governments came here with no money for developing countries, no real emissions cuts, and no ambition to help themselves prepare for a global agreement in 2015.
In conclusion, without the USA ratifying the protocol or recently emerging economic powerhouses such as China reducing emissions drastically, the targets will likely not be met. Even the permissible degree of global warming generated by target levels, if reached, will have far greater environmental impact than was originally envisioned. Therefore, while the Kyoto Protocol has good intentions, it is more of a stepping stone than true revolutionary and major action against emissions and therefore climate change as a whole.
This is what the fuss is all about.
You signed Kyoto, you signed Bali, and now you are wriggling out of it. How do we know whether what you say we sign later will not be treated in the same way?
Poor nations are accusing the rich of trying to kill the Kyoto Protocol, which obliges many industrialized nations to cut on gas emissions which cause global warming. The developed nations, led by the United States and Denmark on the other hand, want a new agreement which will only be politically binding and not legally binding, as in the case of the Kyoto Protocol.
The Kyoto Protocol has the force of law. Kyoto Protocol has a plan of action that you reduce the gases in the atmosphere.
The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Kyoto, Japan in 1997 and came into force in 2005. The most notable non-member of the protocol, despite being a signatory, is the United States, which is responsible for exceptionally huge emission levels. The protocol places a heavier burden on developed nations because it recognizes that they are principally responsible for the current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere after over 150 years of industrial activity. Developing nations want the Kyoto Protocol extended and work out a separate new deal for the poor. But most rich nations want to merge Kyoto into a single new accord, obliging all nations to fight global warming.
If we went beyond 2 degrees centigrade in heating the world, we won't be able to grow tea in Kenya. It is as serious as that.
The Kyoto Protocol is also designed to assist countries in adapting to the adverse effects of climate change. By the end of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol in 2012, a new international framework that can deliver the stringent emission reductions needs to have been negotiated and ratified.
2009, the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference raised climate change policy to the highest political level. Close to 115 world leaders attended the high-level segment, making it one of the largest gatherings of world leaders even outside United Nations headquarters in New York. More than 40,000 people representing governments, non-government organizations, intergovernmental organizations, faith-based organizations, media and UN agencies appealed for accreditation. It was a great event with a lot of expectation, but it was not enough, and especially the poor countries expressed their feeling of being disappointed. They know that climate change deterioration is caused especially by richest countries, where the progress is faster without giving attention to the consequence of climate change. However, the Copenhagen Conference can be considered as an important step to create a new awareness.
This was meant to be the place where the world began its fight back against climate change. 192 countries gathered under the one roof in the Danish capital. And in the end, what they've got is a deal that many people have described as a disaster and a betrayal. He called it a deal, others called it failure.
What we have achieved in Copenhagen will not be the end, but rather the beginning of a new era of international action.
Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
It was a long and difficult day with many discussions and disagreements. The biggest dispute lay between the US and China. The Americans call this deal meaningful, an unprecedented first step. The main details: countries agree to try to limit the global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. There will be a fund of billions of dollars to fight the effects of climate change in poor and vulnerable countries. And there will be an international exchange of information on carbon emission cuts.
To continue moving forward, we must draw on the effort that allowed us to succeed here today. Engagement among nations that represent a baseline of mutual interest and mutual respect. Climate change threatens us all. Therefore, we must bridge old divides and build new partnerships to meet this great challenge of our time.
When 192 countries gathered in Copenhagen at the beginning of this summit, the chance of a legally binding deal was small, but hopes were high something good would emerge. For many, this clearly isn't it.
It's a betrayal of the poor, the betrayal of vulnerable countries, a betrayal of small island states, and it's a betrayal of the future of all children and our grandchildren on this planet.
A deal has got to be fair and just. It's got to commit rich countries to making pledges of at least 40% minimum in terms of cuts. It's got to match the science, and if it doesn't do that, then it's not worth the paper it's written on.
In the halls of the summit centre, the talk was of the deal being done between the US and the emerging economies of China, India, Brazil and South Africa. One leading member of the G77 Developing Nations Group says for a global problem, that's simply not acceptable.
What the world needs is just an equitable deal. What the world needs is a transparent, democratic, participatory process for concluding a deal.
Many world leaders have said that this is just one step when several are needed. Over the next few hours and days, people will begin to examine in detail the Copenhagen Accord to see what's included, but perhaps more significantly, to see what is missing. Copenhagen was to be the time and place where the world began a united fight back against climate change. It was to be historic. In the end, it will be remembered, but not as the great breakthrough everyone hoped.
2010, the Cancun Climate Change Conference drew almost 12,000 participants, including 5,200 governmental officials, 5,400 representatives of United Nations bodies and agencies in their governmental organization and non-governmental organizations, and 1,270 accredited members of the media. The meeting produced the basis for the most comprehensive and far-reaching international response to climate change. The world has even seen to reduce carbon emission and build a system which made all countries accountable to each other for those reductions.
1 year after the failed Copenhagen summit, the international community is meeting once more in Cancun, Mexico, the aim being to reach agreements on ways to combat global warming. Despite enthusiasm aroused by the continuing negotiations, the blogosphere remains mobilized to urge world leaders to reach a consensus. British NGO One World has created a site allowing net users to follow and comment upon debates live, a platform via which they can also ask questions to experts, who will be invited to talk on this web TV channel. This UN conference also boasts an official YouTube channel, broadcasting, for example, this video message from Mexican President Felipe Calderón, who, as host of the event, expresses his hopes for the summit. A Facebook page invites net users to take part in discussions, making their voices heard. The Adopt a Negotiator site unites a dozen activist bloggers who have gone to Cancun to monitor the activities of their respective countries' negotiators. In his latest message, the French representative describes the atmosphere in Cancun and does not seem optimistic about the chance of this summit reaching an agreement. But many net users worldwide are keeping their faith alive. Over 17 million of them are thought to have signed this online petition since the start of the campaign last year, urging their leaders to reach a consensus to curb climate change.
In the depth of this great British freeze, it's hard to imagine how the latest figures can show that the average world temperature is actually reaching new heights. This year is heading to be one of the warmest on record. That might be believable if you're in the Mexican resort of Cancun right now. That's the venue for the latest round of United Nations talks aimed at tackling global warming. The Climate Change Secretary, heading there tomorrow, is hopeful.
I have a great belief that the quality of the science, the quality of the evidence, which is continuing to mount, will finally persuade people to pull back from the brink and get their signatures on a legally binding deal.
What's at stake is a deal to cut pollution, the greenhouse gases widely accepted to be warming the climate. But the biggest polluter, China, doesn't want to be in a treaty. And America, gripped by recession, doesn't either, especially with the Republicans making big gains in the recent elections.
Many of the people who joined the Congress were even more skeptical of the climate science and certainly more knowledgeable and skeptical of the climate economics than those who came before them. They're not going to join any treaty that makes the U.S. put on her shirt.
Efforts to get international action have been long and often faltering. Back in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, countries agreed to tackle dangerous climate change. 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was agreed, but it went ahead without America and China. They never accepted targets for cuts. Then, last year, a summit in Copenhagen was meant to produce a new global treaty, but only led to the Copenhagen Accord. Nothing legally binding, and some think that nothing more is possible. Among them, John Prescott, the former Deputy Prime Minister who battled to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol and now says the failure at Copenhagen means a formal treaty may never happen.
There wasn't a chance of getting a legal agreement if that's what you're trying to do, as I did at Kyoto in 1997. What you've got to find is a way forward, a more voluntary system.
In Cancun, the Mexican president unveiled a wind turbine meant to power the talks. It's not spinning rapidly. And Greenpeace launched a balloon filled with hot air, exactly what this UN process is accused of. Expectations are low, while levels of greenhouse gases just keep rising.
May 24, 2015, Laudato Si. This is an Italian medieval center that means praise be to you. It's an encyclical letter of Pope Francis. This encyclical letter has the subtitle On Care for Our Common Home. In it, the Pope critiques consumerism and irresponsible development, laments environmental degradation and global warming, and calls all people of the world to take swift and unified global action. The encyclical letter was a prophetic voice to the Paris Agreement and still remains an important voice for humanity in this alarming time of climate change. This is not an international conference, but it is a message of Pope Francis for all, and the impact has been bigger than many other international agreements because the Pope presents the situation of the common home, the hurt, touching the heart of all.
Pope Francis has written a letter addressed to every person on this planet, urging us all to protect the Earth, our common home. In the letter, he says, "The Earth is God's gift to us, full of beauty and wonder, where the fruits of the earth belong to everyone. But what we see today is that our common home has never been so hurt and mistreated as it has been in the last 200 years. We have developed at a greater speed than we could ever have imagined. We have treated the Earth like it has an unlimited supply of resources, taking more than our fair share from most people on the planet, as well as future generations to come. We have stripped the Earth of its natural forests, contaminated the Earth's waters, its land, and its air. Plants and species are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. The Earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Our increasing use of polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, oil, and gas, is helping to drive climate change, which is one of the biggest challenges we face today. Climate change affects us all, but it is the poorest communities who suffer the most. We are now at crisis point, where the future of our common home is under threat. And despite this crisis, there seems to be no slowdown in the lifestyles of the rich nations. Enormous gaps between the rich and the poor continue to rise. Between those who are trapped in poverty with few or no resources, and those who are consuming and wasting at an ever-increasing rate, leaving a trail of waste and destruction. Our digital world is also polluting us with noise and distractions, stopping us from learning how to live wisely, to think deeply, and to love generously. Real relationships are replaced with virtual friendships, which we can choose to accept or reject, making us dissatisfied with true, deep relationships, or can give rise to a new sense of isolation. Yet, despite all of this, all is not lost. Young people demand change. Young people want to build a better future, which takes seriously the environmental crisis and the sufferings of the poor. So we can change. We can make a new start. To protect our common home, we need a common plan. The whole human family needs to work together so that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Our use of polluting fossil fuels also needs to be replaced without delay. And we need to stop treating the world's resources as an object for profit, with no thought on how our actions might affect the environment or future generations. So let's put love for the world and love for our neighbour into action by living together in harmony, listening to one another, caring for nature, and getting involved with society and politics. Let's undergo an eco-conversion in which we listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. This means taking seriously things like avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water waste, separating rubbish, and using public transport as a part of our calling to protect creation. But more urgently, we need to slow down on how much we consume and throw away. We can find great joy and freedom in living simply, rather than always on the lookout for what we do not have. We are capable of these changes and making a new start. So let us make that start today. Signed, Pope Francis. Laudato Si, a letter from Pope Francis on care for our common home.
December 15, 2015, the Paris Agreement for the first time brings all nations into a common cause based on the historical, current, and future responsibility. The Paris Agreement is an historical agreement to combat climate change and unleash action and investment toward a low carbon, resilient and sustainable future was agreed by 195 nations in Paris. To reach this ambitious and important goal, appropriate financial flow will be put in place, thus making stronger action by developing countries and the most vulnerable possible, in line with their own national objectives.
The world is facing a climate emergency. The Earth's temperature has already increased by 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this is causing severe impacts on water supplies, biodiversity, oceans, food production, and extreme climatic events. At the Paris Climate Conference in December of 2015, 195 countries reached agreement on the first truly global agreement to control greenhouse gas emissions and confront the impacts of climate change. The countries agreed to hold temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and to make efforts to stay below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The emission reductions goals that countries presented so far would allow for a global average temperature increase of at least 2.7 degrees, with potentially catastrophic impacts. The new global agreement includes national targets for 2025 or 2030 for most countries. In 2018 and every 5 years thereafter, there will be a review of what has been achieved by then, along with the future targets and proposed measures. This process will give countries an opportunity to increase their efforts and put forward stronger targets and actions. A climate movement is building around the world and being led by different actors from civil society, business, and faith groups. They are demanding climate justice and greater action for a low-carbon future and a safe climate. This movement will continue to call on global leaders to build on the work started in Paris. You can be part of this movement. Become informed, live a sustainable lifestyle, discuss climate change with your family, friends, and colleagues, and demand action from decision makers in your country. The climate and the quality of life and prosperity depend on it. Be part of the solution.
You've seen this term COP21 popping up.
Welcome, climate counselors, to the COP21 at Paris.
Firstly, this Paris Agreement includes the ambition to keep global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
No agreement is perfect, including this one. Negotiations that involve nearly 200 nations are always challenging. Even if all the initial targets set in Paris are met, we'll only be part of the way there when it comes to reducing carbon from the atmosphere.
An INDC, it's an intended, nationally determined contribution. These are the sum total of the efforts of each party to contribute to trying to meet the objective of the convention, to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
All of those pledges will be reviewed every 5 years.
It doesn't go quite as far as some of us might wish, but it's certainly a major step down the road.
The actual targets that they have brought to the summit lead us to an extremely dangerous world. They lead us to warming of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is beyond catastrophic.
Paris for us is just a step. There is also this massive international movement organizing itself, and this is why those spaces are so important for people to meet, for people to organize, for people to train, for people to share skills, and it's exactly what's happening. So I think it's really giving us a perspective.
Je regarde la salle, je vois que la réaction est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
At the Paris Climate Conference in December 2015, 195 countries agreed to the world's first universal action plan to tackle climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. This historic achievement was just the beginning. Now, every country must turn their promises into action. Human activities such as burning fossil fuels, livestock farming, and deforestation cause global temperatures to surge. Rising sea levels will put coasts and low-lying islands at risk. Severe droughts and superstorms will become more frequent. And 1 in 6 of Earth's species will be threatened. This is why, in Paris, countries committed to tackle climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and taking measures to adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. This will require a worldwide economic transformation, unlocking the potential of renewables, making agriculture more sustainable, decarbonizing transport, and redesigning the electricity market. This transition will bring new opportunities to industries investors, and innovative companies. And the more a country does, the more its citizens will benefit through job creation, smarter products, cleaner air, and more secure energy supplies. Making this happen will be a challenge. We all have a role to play. More than 10,000 companies, investors, regions, cities, and civil society organizations are already taking action across the globe. But climate change-related events are already happening more frequently. All countries are affected and face the task of building up their resilience to environmental changes. One thing is certain, international cooperation is key to reach a global climate solution. Developed countries have committed to helping others with technology, strengthening institutions, and also finance. Other countries, including emerging economies, are also increasingly providing support to the most vulnerable nations. The European Union is already putting its Paris commitment into action and will reduce its emissions by at least 40% by 2030. Since 1990, the EU has already reduced its emissions by almost a quarter, while at the same time growing its economy by almost 50%. The Paris Agreement gives us a global action plan to fight climate change. By working together, we can build a safer and more sustainable world for us all and for future generations.
At this point, we give a special attention to Laudato Si. We can say that Laudato Si is a new source of inspiration for all and encourages us in the Silsila Dialogue movement in our advocacy to take good care for the environment. For Silsila, the encyclical letter is a sign of the time. The Pope says, I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet.
Pope Francis has just released his new encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. Here are the top 10 messages of the new encyclical. First, the big contribution of Laudato Si is an overview of the environmental crisis from a religious point of view. Until now, the dialogue about the environment was framed mainly with political, scientific, and economic language. Now, the language of faith decisively enters the discussion. Second, the disproportionate effect of environmental change on the poor is strongly highlighted in almost every page of the document, and the Pope provides many examples of the effects of climate change, whose worst impacts, he says, are felt by those in developing countries. Third, Pope Francis takes aim at the technocratic mindset, where technology is seen as the key to human existence. He critiques an unthinking reliance on market forces in which every technological advancement is embraced before thinking about how it will affect our world. Christian spirituality, by contrast, offers a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. Fourth, against those who argue that a papal encyclical on the environment has no real authority, Pope Francis explicitly states that Laudato Si is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching. It continues reflection on modern-day problems that began with Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum on capital and labor in 1891. Fifth, discussions about ecology can be grounded in the Bible and church tradition. In Chapter 2, Pope Francis introduces the Gospel of Creation, in which he leads readers through the call to care for creation that extends as far back as the book of Genesis, when humankind was called to till and keep the earth. But sadly, we have done too much tilling and not enough keeping. Sixth, everything is connected. Laudato Si is a systematic approach to the problem. First, the Pope links all of us to creation. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. But our decisions have an inevitable effect on the environment. A blind pursuit of money that sets aside the interests of the marginalized and poor and the ruination of the planet are connected. Seventh, Pope Francis does not try to prove anything about climate change. Rather, his encyclical accepts the best scientific research available today and builds on it. So Laudato Si draws on both church teaching and contemporary scientific findings from all fields to help modern-day people reflect on important questions. Eighth, Pope Francis critiques those who ignore the problems of climate change, and especially its effect on the poor. Why are so many of the wealthy turning away from the poor? Not only because some view themselves as more worthy than others, but also because frequently decision makers are, for the most part, removed from the poor, with no real physical connection to their brothers and sisters. Selfishness also leads to the evaporation of the notion of the common good. Ninth, perhaps more than any encyclical, Pope Francis draws from the experiences of people from around the world, referring to the findings of bishops' conferences in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The Pope calls into dialogue and debate all people about our common home. And finally, this encyclical is addressed to everyone on the planet and calls for a new way of looking at things. We face an urgent crisis when the earth has begun more and more to look like, in Pope Francis's vivid language, an immense pile of filth. Still, the document is hopeful, reminding us that because God is with us, all of us can strive to change course. We can move towards an ecological conversion in which we can listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. To use religious language, what the Pope is calling for is conversion.
Pope Francis has called on the world's 1.2 billion Catholics to act on climate change, an issue that impacts the world's poorest people most. The Catholic faith has a long tradition of caring for God's creation, a tradition that starts with Genesis. The Bible says that in the beginning, God created the earth and entrusted humankind to care for it. Even in the Middle Ages, Catholic leaders such as St. Francis of Assisi preached the moral duty of humanity to protect the environment. Pope Francis also follows in the footsteps of modern-day Catholic leaders, including his predecessors, Pope Benedict XVI and Pope John Paul II, who both called for climate action. Today, the moral call to protect God's creation and our vulnerable neighbors is more urgent than ever before. Stand with Pope Francis and the message of the encyclical. Take action on climate change today.
When the Silsila started in 1984, its first member agreed to follow a spirituality or life in dialogue based on the 4 pillars of dialogue, identified as dialogue with God, dialogue with the self, dialogue with others, and dialogue with creation. The dialogue with creation is becoming an urgent sign of the time and a new challenge. It urges people, Muslim and Christians, and all people of goodwill to work together for the common good. This is true, especially here in Mindanao, where the projected future peace is focused too much on local interest and is therefore putting little attention on holistic dialogue with creation. Laudato Si comes as a new challenge, one that has to be faced together because it goes beyond the territorial and political issues. The encyclical letter Laudato Si says that the climate is a common good belonging to all and meant for all. This is true for all around the world. Each one has to think globally and act locally. For Silsila, dialogue with creation is a continuous reminder and on some occasion has been a great challenge. One such occasion was a few years ago when the need to work together for the protection of the Yala watershed arose. Muslims and Christians worked hand in hand with Silsila against the coming of a mining company whose exploration was already supported by some sector of the government. On that occasion, Silsila spearheaded the group known as Friends of Ayala Watershed. The movement's presence became frequent, felt in radio, television, and other forms of advocacy. The most touching experience was when two lawyers, one Muslim, one Christian, offered their services for free to support our advocacy in front of the city councillors. After facing different challenges, this effort has been able to gather 10,000 people from all walks of life belonging to different faith affiliation in a rally in the very heart of the Zamboanga city. Surely, that activity created a certain impact that led to a great achievement. Thanks to God, the voice of the people was heard and the permit given to the mining companies was cancelled. Aside from being an achievement, the occasion served as an opportunity to show solidarity among Muslims and Christians. Encouraged by this positive experience, Silsila is still on the move in protecting all the watershed of Zamboanga as a concrete commitment to care for our common home, the earth. Laudato Si encourage each one to come together. People of different cultures and religions convinced that humanity's universal fraternity. Moreover, the clear vision of the spiritual perspective given priority by the Pope in the Encyclical letter is also a source of great inspiration. This perspective is taken as fundamental part of environmental discernment. Laudato Si says, "We are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us." This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. This responsibility of God's help means that the human beings, endued with intelligence, must respect the law of nature and the delicate equilibrium existing between the creatures of the world. Focusing on human fraternity and environmental discernment, Pope Francis quoted the story of two brothers, Cain and Abel, a story well known among Muslim and Christian as it is related both in the Bible and in the Quran. From this terrible story, the Holy Father made one of the most dramatic reflections in Laudato Si, saying, God asked, "Where is Abel, your brother?" Cain answered that he does not know, and God persists, "What we have done?" Furthermore, those who thought to find in Laudato Si a scientific and academic presentation on climate change will not find all the answers. With them, also those who are involved in aggressive economy without ethical principle in using natural resources will be disappointed. For sure, the letter is a strong message that would touch the conscience of every person who read it. God's question addressed to Cain, "What have you done?" comes as a basic question worth reflecting upon today in the light of Laudato Si. The same question reminds us that when nature is viewed as a source of profit and gain, this has serious consequences for society. This vision of might is right has engendered immense inequality. Injustice is an act of violence against the majority of humanity, since resources end in the hands of the first comer or most powerful, the winner takes all. We are the Cain of the modern society. If we do not listen the voice of the conscience echoing in Laudato Si, how can we say that we are a civilized and religious people and yet continue to abuse creation?
Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore. Yes, be praised in all your creatures, sun, our brother, moon, our sister, in the stars and in the breezes, air and fire and flowing water. Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore. Thank you for the earth, our mother, she who feeds us and sustains us, for our fruits, our grass, our flowers, for the mountains and the oceans. Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore. Praise for those who spread forgiveness, those who share your peace with others, bearing trials and sickness bravely, even sister death for them. Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore. Life is but a song of worship, and the reason for our singing is to praise you for the music. Join the dance of all creation. Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore. Praise to you, our God and Father, praise and thanks to you, Lord Jesus, praise to you, most Holy Spirit, life and joy of all creation. Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, oh mi Signore, Laudato Si, Laudato Si.
All this international agreement and the experience that we have seen in the Philippines about climate change urge us and Silsila to continue our commitment. It is our desire to launch at the end of this School of Dialogue with Creation a movement called Dialogue with Creation Partner Movement. I'm sure that all of us will be interested to join this movement. The future of the world is alarming for many reasons, and one of these is the greed that nations continue to practice without proper attention to the common good. I end this message with a quotation of Mahatma Gandhi. The world can answer to the needs of all, but not to the greed of all. Transformation can happen if we are ready to move with determination, starting from the ecology of the heart. This is a challenge for all of us. Padayon.